September 17, 1944. At 14,000 feet above Eindhoven, the morning sky trembled with the roar of engines. The largest airborne assault in military history, Operation Market Garden, was unfolding. But this story isn't about paratroopers. It's about the unexpected force above them. Thunder rolled through the clouds, not from storms but from squadrons of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts streaking toward their targets, heavy with bombs. To the German Luftwaffe pilots scrambling to intercept, it was a nightmare made real. What they once dismissed as overweight, sluggish American fighters were now bearing down on them, carrying bomb loads that rivaled medium bombers. 18 months earlier, such a sight would have seemed impossible. Back then, the P-47 was just a brute, a single-seat, single-engine interceptor that struggled to keep up with the nimble Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs. German intelligence dismissed it outright. Too heavy, too slow, poor in a dogfight. But the Americans saw something else. Potential. The kind that could be shaped, adapted, and transformed. And they did just that. What emerged wasn't just a fighter, and not quite a bomber. It was something entirely new. When the P-47 first entered combat in April 1943, it reinforced the Luftwaffe's arrogance. At 10,000 pounds empty, it was twice the weight of the nimble Bf-109. Its massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine pushed out 2,000 horsepower, but its bulk made it sluggish in tight turns. German pilots learned quickly to force it into dogfights, where its size became a liability. The Thunderbolt, they believed, was no real threat. What they didn't see was the machine's hidden strength: steel tubing, armor plating, and wing pylons engineered to take more weight than any fighter in the sky. The P-47 wasn't losing the war, it was just getting started. As 1943 wore on, American pilots began experimenting. On their way back from bomber escort missions, they started strafing railcars, fuel convoys, and tinsoys, and enemy trucks. The results were staggering. With 850 caliber machine guns, the P-47 could spit 12.7 pounds of lead per second, shredding locomotives and blowing apart supply lines. The U.S. Army Air Forces took note. By November, engineers were modifying the Thunderbolts to carry bombs. They added belly shackle mounts, wing pylons, and release mechanisms. On November 25, 1943, 8 Thunderbolts dropped bombs on a Luftwaffe airfield in Saint-Omer, France, destroying hangars and crippling enemy planes on the ground. It was the beginning of something no one could have predicted. What followed was a feverish transformation. Through the winter of 1943 to 44, engineers reinforced the P-47's wings to handle asymmetric loads. They equipped it with rockets that could match the firepower of naval artillery. They designed new targeting sites to deliver bombs from treetop level or 30,000 feet. The Thunderbolt wasn't just becoming more capable, it was redefining what a fighter could be. And by D-Day, June 6, 1944, the P-47 was a juggernaut. On that single day, it flew nearly 2,000 sorties, dropped over 500 tons of bombs, and fired more than 135,000 rounds. The Luftwaffe watched, stunned, as 86 locomotives, 507 vehicles, 38 gun emplacements, and 17 fuel depots were destroyed. That summer, Luftwaffe ace Günther Rahl, a man with 275 aerial victories, faced off against the Thunderbolts. He remembered their diving speed, the sheer velocity that left his Messerschmitt powerless to escape. "We knew right away," he said years later, "they could dive faster than anything we had." On May 12, 1944, Rahl was shot down by a P-47. He survived, but not without losing a thumb. His bloodied flight glove is now on display at the Smithsonian. It tells the story of a man who thought he understood war until the Thunderbolt rewrote the rules. By the end of that summer, it was clear. The P-47 wasn't a fighter or a bomber. It was a new kind of war machine, one that could dive from the sky like a hawk, unleash a storm of steel and fire, then climb back into the heavens, ready to do it all again. And the Luftwaffe? They had no answer. But the story of the Thunderbolt was just beginning. In the next part, we'll follow the devastating impact of the P-47 through the fall of 1944. When its rocket barrages and relentless precision left German forces reeling, and American air dominance was sealed in the smoke of crushed convoys and shattered steel. August 1944. The war in Europe was at a turning point. German forces were reeling from defeats in Normandy, retreating through the hedgerows of France. But for the retreating Wehrmacht, salvation would not come. The skies above them belonged to the Thunderbolts, and in the narrow roads of the Falaise pocket, P-47s proved what true air superiority looked like. It wasn't grand strategy that sealed the German fate, it was relentless pressure. The US 9th Air Force organized P-47 groups into a round-the-clock operation. As one squadron flew, another rearmed. As bombs fell and rockets screamed, new aircraft were already rising to take their place. The result was a conveyor belt of destruction from dawn to dusk. German vehicles became moving targets. Columns of armor, horse-drawn carts, and supply trucks turned to twisted wreckage by day's end. August 13th, 112 tanks destroyed. August the 14th, 287 motor vehicles reduced to fire and scrap. August 15th, 42 locomotives hit with pinpoint accuracy. On August 16th, even horse-drawn wagons, still crucial to German logistics, were fair game, 89 obliterated in a single day. The P-47 wasn't just disrupting German retreat, it was eviscerating it. Luftwaffe reconnaissance could barely track losses before more arrived. Then came the rockets. September saw the introduction of the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, the HVAR. Each was capable of punching through the armor of a Tiger tank. A single Thunderbolt could carry 10 of them. The effect was transformative. P-47s were now not just hunters, they were tank killers. The 362nd Fighter Group led the charge. Their tactics were surgical. Dive from 5,000 feet, release at 1,500, and pull out low. Their accuracy defied expectations, achieving hit rates far beyond what artillery could manage. The German armored divisions began to fear not just ambushes from hedgerows, but from the heavens. No tank formation could move in daylight without risking annihilation. Bridges were targeted to trap fleeing units, railroads severed. Even static defensive positions were smoked out by napalm, unleashed in terrifying waves from modified drop tanks. But perhaps the most telling sign of the P-47's dominance was in how it changed the very behavior of German units. Troops no longer moved during the day. Convoys waited for nightfall. Logistics slowed. Fuel ran short. Ammunition failed to arrive. By paralyzing mobility, the Thunderbolt was choking the Wehrmacht without needing to confront it head-on. In this way, the P-47 was no longer just supporting the front, it was defining it. Yet even as the aircraft's arsenal grew, so did its versatility. The Thunderbolt became a forward air controller, spotting for artillery, relaying positions to ground units. It carried reconnaissance cameras, communication radios, even dropped psychological warfare leaflets. The same plane that had leveled tanks in the morning could guide medevac units by afternoon. It was a tool forged for any task, each mission further proving its worth. The Luftwaffe, once feared for its precision, agility, and innovation, could do little. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Supply lines vanished under fire. Even the feared Me-262 jets couldn't operate without long, exposed runways. Runways now under constant watch by Thunderbolts. Time and again, the story repeated. German aircraft caught during takeoff, destroyed before ever leaving the ground. The myth of German air superiority had collapsed. The P-47 hadn't just earned a place in the skies, it had claimed dominion over them. What began as an interceptor had become the most feared silhouette over Europe. In Part 3, we'll follow the Thunderbolt into the heart of the Battle of the Bulge, where winter storms and blinding snow could not ground the aircraft that had become the backbone of tactical air power. The Luftwaffe was on the ropes, but the worst was still to come. December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes lay buried under snow. Visibility dropped with each gust of wind, fog blanketing the hills like a curtain drawn across the battlefield. It was in this frozen silence that Hitler launched his final desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive. What the world would come to know as the Battle of the Bulge. American forces, caught off guard, braced against the onslaught. But while the ground war surged in bitter cold, the skies seemed closed, until the P-47 found a way through. Most aircraft remained grounded. Icy runways, freezing cockpits, and blinding weather shut down entire air groups. But not the Thunderbolts. With British-developed rocket rails and upgraded instrumentation, the P-47s adapted once more. Equipped for all-weather operations, they clawed their way into the sky. When the clouds finally parted on December 23rd, the waiting P-47s surged forward in waves, striking with a fury born of vengeance and precision. That day, they flew 647 sorties, nearly 650 missions in a matter of hours. Their toll was staggering. Over 400 German vehicles were destroyed. Tanks turned to scorched husks. Convoys scattered like broken toys across snow-covered roads. For the German soldiers trapped in the woods, the sound of Thunderbolts overhead was no longer just a warning. It was a sentence. Over 5 days, the statistics mounted with grim clarity. 201 tanks destroyed, 1,930 motor vehicles left burning. Nearly 1,000 horse-drawn wagons, the last lifeline for many German units, reduced to ash. The carnage extended to infrastructure. 89 locomotives knocked out, 512 rail cars shattered, 47 bridges dropped. Every hit was a link in the chain breaking Germany's ability to sustain its offensive. And it wasn't just about destruction. The Thunderbolts adapted in real time. When bridges that survived heavy bombing proved critical to German logistics, P-47 groups developed new tactics. The 56th Fighter Group led precision strikes in steep 60-degree dives, placing 1,000-pound bombs within 500 feet of their targets, something heavy bombers couldn't reliably achieve even from higher altitudes. Bridges that had withstood a dozen attacks were brought down by just 8 Thunderbolts. In the cold grip of winter, the P-47 revealed its ultimate strength, not just as a machine of war, but as a weapon of adaptation. The Luftwaffe, once the pinnacle of aerial warfare, now struggled to maintain even token presence in the air. Without fuel, without protection, and without maneuvering room, they were hunted. Their jets might be faster, but they couldn't outrun the reality of war. Versatility won battles, and the P-47 reigned supreme in that domain. By the time January 1945 arrived, the lines had shifted again, but the Thunderbolt remained, unchanged in purpose, ever-evolving in method. It had become the fist of the Allied advance, hammering every retreating unit, every desperate push with the same relentless tempo. In Part 4, we'll witness how the P-47 took on the German jet menace and why speed alone couldn't save the future of the Luftwaffe. The Thunderbolt's legacy was just beginning to crystallize, not in the past, but in what it meant for the wars yet to come. January 1945. The snow had begun to melt, but the war was far from thawing. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, a new threat emerged from the horizon, one that, for a brief moment, rekindled German hopes. The Me-262. Sleek, fast, and jet-powered, it promised to change everything. But speed alone does not win wars. And the P-47 Thunderbolt, forged through years of adaptation, was waiting. The Messerschmitt MT-262 was a marvel of engineering. With a top speed surpassing 500 mph, it could outrun any Allied aircraft. On paper, it seemed invincible. In the skies, it often was, so long as it stayed there, but jet engines were temperamental beasts. They devoured fuel and required long concrete runways to take off. That vulnerability didn't escape the attention of American strategists, and it certainly didn't escape the P-47 squadrons tasked with ending the jet threat before it could take hold. On March 21, 1945, the 365th Fighter Group struck the heart of the German jet program. As Me-262s began their takeoff roll at Leipheim Airfield, Thunderbolts swooped in. In less than 5 minutes, they destroyed 8 jets before their wheels even left the runway. It was a stunning blow. The Luftwaffe couldn't produce that many aircraft in a week. Germany's jet dream grounded before it ever truly took flight. It wasn't the only attack of its kind. P-47s had become specialists in hunting down Me-262s on the ground. They patrolled known airfields, waited for movement, then pounced. The Thunderbolt's speed in a dive and its firepower made it lethal in this role. Even when jets managed to get airborne, their lack of maneuverability during acceleration made them easy targets. More than once, P-47s intercepted 262s as they struggled to build speed, turning their futuristic profiles into wreckage on the tarmac. The irony was clear. Germany had leapt ahead in technology, but failed to adapt it to the realities of war. The Americans had built something else, something less elegant, but far more effective. The P-47 wasn't born to outpace jets. It didn't need to. Its role had evolved. Deny the enemy the space, the time, the logistics to fight. In that, it excelled beyond measure. Meanwhile, Operation Clarion was underway, a systematic campaign to destroy what remained of the German transportation network. The P-47 was no longer just a tactical weapon, it was strategic now. On March 22nd alone, Thunderbolts claimed 89 locomotives, 1,026 railcars, 155 vehicles, and 17 bridges. That wasn't air support, that was paralysis. The final months of the war showed just how deeply the P-47 had reshaped doctrine. It didn't replace the heavy bomber, but it outperformed it in flexibility and cost. It didn't replace the dogfighter, but it could defend itself with deadly competence. It wasn't built to be a jack of all trades, but it became the master of many. In Part 5, we'll dive into the remarkable innovations that kept the Thunderbolt evolving until the war's end. From napalm to zero-length rocket launches, from psychological warfare to photo reconnaissance, the P-47 had become not just an aircraft, but a philosophy in motion. By February 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become something far more than a fighter. It was a flying arsenal, a scout, a communicator, even a weapon of psychological warfare. What had started as a heavy interceptor was now one of the most adaptable machines of war ever created. And as the Allies pushed into the heart of Germany, that versatility was being tested and proven on every mission. One of the most dramatic transformations came with the introduction of napalm. The Thunderbolt had already carried an impressive payload: bombs, rockets, machine guns, but now it could rain fire. Modified drop tanks, filled with jellied gasoline, became deadly weapons that could incinerate enemy positions in seconds. On February 14, 1945, the 362nd Fighter Group unleashed napalm on a Wehrmacht supply depot hidden in the Reichswald forest. 8 P-47s carried one napalm tank and one 500-pound bomb each. The result was a firestorm that destroyed 3 acres of critical supplies, visible from 20 miles away. As the front lines shifted almost daily, Thunderbolts adapted to new missions without pause. Forward air control, artillery spotting, reconnaissance, they did it all. One flight might begin with a bombing run, then switch to guiding other aircraft, relaying communications to ground forces, or dropping leaflets to demoralize retreating German troops. In desperate moments, they even delivered emergency supplies to encircled American units. The same aircraft that obliterated a tank column in the morning could be guiding wounded troops to safety by nightfall. The innovations didn't stop. The P-47D-25, introduced mid-1944, was a machine rebuilt for modern war. It boasted reinforced wings rated for a 3,000-pound external load, universal bomb shackles that could carry British and American ordnance, and zero-length rocket launchers to reduce drag. Cooling systems were improved for low-altitude missions. Paddle blade propellers allowed for quicker acceleration, while water injection systems boosted the engine to 2,800 horsepower in combat situations. And the K-14 computing gun sight gave pilots precision bombing capabilities that rivaled bombers. At its production peak, Republic Aviation delivered 35 P-47s per day. They never stopped the production line for a redesign. Improvements were folded in real time. That required an unprecedented level of field adaptability. Over 430 field modification kits were developed, enabling ground crews to keep aircraft up to date with minimal downtime. From Farmingdale to Evansville, the Thunderbolt rolled out with greater capability each week. Training programs were equally revolutionary. Pilots weren't just trained to dogfight. They logged over 200 hours before combat, including dive bombing, rocket attacks, instrument flying, and navigation. They could shift seamlessly between missions. One pilot might fly bomber escort at high altitude in the morning, then dive bomber bridge at low altitude in the afternoon. This kind of tactical flexibility had no precedent. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was now on life support. Even their most advanced fighters were helpless, not because of inferior design, but because their doctrine had failed to adapt. American pragmatism, industrial scale, and a relentless drive to innovate had flipped the script. German pilots were now the hunted. In Part 6, we'll explore how the P-47 closed out the war with a series of crippling blows against German infrastructure, reshaping not just the battlefield, but the entire doctrine of air power in the process. March 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final act, but the skies above Germany had never been more dangerous. What remained of the Nazi war machine depended on one thing: movement, fuel to the front, troops to the defense, supplies to the last pockets of resistance. And it was precisely this dependency that the P-47 Thunderbolt was about to destroy. Operation Clarion had begun. Its mission: annihilate Germany's transportation infrastructure. But this wasn't carried out by fleets of lumbering bombers. It was led by fighter bombers, primarily the P-47. Thunderbolt squadrons were assigned sectors and given simple orders: destroy anything that moved or could move. Rail lines, bridges, roads, trains, trucks. If it rolled, it burned. On March 22nd alone, P-47s delivered a staggering blow. They destroyed 89 locomotives, over 1,000 railcars, 155 motor vehicles, 17 bridges, and severed rail lines in 93 locations. In a single day, the arteries of Germany's war effort were shredded. It wasn't just disruption, it was dismemberment. The P-47 had become an executioner, severing limbs from a dying giant. And it did so with ruthless efficiency. Each Thunderbolt carried a payload rivaling a light bomber, a standard loadout, 2 1,000-pound bombs or 10 high-velocity rockets, allowed a single pilot to destroy a bridge, crater a rail line, or obliterate a vehicle column. Multiply that by a squadron flying 3 sorties a day from forward airfields, and the math became devastating. The cost difference was even more telling. A B-17 Flying Fortress, carrying 4,000 pounds of bombs, required 10 crew members and extensive ground support. A single P-47, delivering over half that bomb load, needed just 1 pilot and a small crew. The Thunderbolt didn't just win through firepower, it won through economy. At a fraction of the cost and manpower, it delivered nearly the same destructive force, 3 times per day. By now, the Luftwaffe was a ghost of its former self, not for lack of aircraft, but for lack of fuel, airfields, and safe passage. P-47s had turned their operational bases into graveyards. Even the feared Me-262 jets had nowhere to hide. Jet runways were under constant threat. Any movement on them drew immediate retaliation from circling Thunderbolts. In just one such strike, 8 Me-262s were destroyed during takeoff, more than the Luftwaffe could replace in a week. The Thunderbolt's evolution had transformed it into something no one had predicted. It was no longer merely a fighter bomber. It was strategic leverage. Its targets weren't just tactical: supply lines, convoys, gun emplacements. They were foundational to the German war effort. Each locomotive destroyed wasn't just a machine lost. It was coal not delivered, troops not moved, weapons never arriving. And the impact was measurable. Allied intelligence reported that by March 1945, German rail traffic in forward areas had dropped by 75%, not due to strategic bombing from high altitudes, but from low-flying, fast-hitting fighter bombers like the P-47. The result? Reinforcements starved, counterattacks stalled, and frontline units left isolated. In Part 7, we'll examine how the P-47 helped bring about the final collapse, not by engaging in grand battles, but by choking Germany's ability to wage war itself. With its unmatched efficiency and relentless pressure, the Thunderbolt became the weapon that could end a war without ever needing to fire the last shot. April 1945. Germany was crumbling. The Reich, once spread across Europe, was shrinking fast under the weight of Allied boots and bombs. But the final blows weren't delivered by massive bombing raids or armored divisions alone. They were dealt by the relentless hum of P-47 Thunderbolts sweeping across the skies in endless, disciplined waves. By now, the aircraft had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a signal that the end had come. German forces couldn't move by daylight. Supply convoys, troop transports, even single motorcycles. Anything that stirred drew fire. The Thunderbolts had made the open road a death trap. Bridges, if they still stood, were under constant surveillance. Rail yards had become tombs of steel. The Wehrmacht's carefully managed logistics had disintegrated, not through dramatic explosions, but by steady, constant interruption. The P-47 didn't just bomb. It starved an army. The numbers told a brutal truth. By April, the Luftwaffe could field barely 100 operational fighters on any given day, not because they lacked aircraft, but because they lacked fuel, mechanics, and airfields. Those support systems had been systematically erased. P-47s had taken the battlefield beyond the front lines. No rear area was safe. No resupply effort unchallenged. Even the famed panzer divisions found themselves trapped, not by enemy tanks, but by empty fuel drums and broken roads. Meanwhile, the US Army Air Forces took stock of what the Thunderbolt had accomplished. Over 746,000 combat sorties flown. Nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. Over 3,200 more taken out on the ground. 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 rail cars, 68,000 motor vehicles, 6,000 armored vehicles. These were not just targets, they were lifelines. And one by one, the P-47 had severed them. Even more impressive was how efficiently it had done so. Each Thunderbolt sortie carried destruction at a cost that stunned military economists. Per ton of bombs delivered, a P-47 cost just $4,200, compared to $28,000 for a B-17. Where the B-17 needed 10 crew members per mission, the P-47 needed just one. Where a heavy bomber required 47 ground personnel per ton of bombs delivered, the Thunderbolt needed only 8. The arithmetic of war had changed. The Luftwaffe veterans who survived offered their own testimony. In post-war interviews, many admitted the P-47 had been underestimated. Its size, once mocked, had become its strength. Its engine, once dismissed as excessive, proved durable, powerful, and most critically, leak-free, unlike German counterparts. Former ace Günther Rahl, who had flown and been shot down by a Thunderbolt, described it as unstoppable in a dive. Others echoed his respect, not just for the machine, but for the way it had been employed. By April's end, the German war machine was no longer functioning, it was dying in place. Not from lack of will, but from lack of motion. The P-47 had taught a hard lesson. In modern warfare, it wasn't enough to win battles. You had to control the space between them. And that's where the Thunderbolt reigned. In Part 8, we'll examine how the Thunderbolt's legacy was not just in its wartime victories, but in the doctrine it left behind, a redefinition of what air power meant, and how future wars would be fought by aircraft born to do more than fly and fight. May 1945. As Germany surrendered and the guns fell silent, the world began to measure the cost of victory. Amid the ruins of Europe, the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt stood out, not just for its performance, but for how it had reshaped the very nature of warfare. Its legacy would not be built solely on missions flown or targets destroyed, but on how it forced a rewriting of air combat doctrine for generations to come. Before the war, air power doctrine was rigid. Bombers bombed, fighters fought. Attack aircraft handled ground support. Each machine had its role, and stepping outside that lane was discouraged. But the P-47 shattered those boundaries. It didn't ask permission to evolve. It adapted because the battlefield demanded it. And in doing so, it exposed the limitations of an overly specialized military mindset. Strategic bombing by high-altitude bombers had long been considered the key to victory. Yet despite years of pounding German industry, it was the tactical destruction of logistics, railways, fuel depots, and supply convoys that finally paralyzed the Wehrmacht. The Thunderbolt did what squadrons of B-17's could not. It made movement impossible. In the end, it wasn't factories that doomed Germany. It was the inability to move the weapons they had left. In 1947, just 2 years after the war's end, the newly formed US Air Force released its first doctrine manual. It declared the old divisions between fighters and attack aircraft obsolete. All fighters, it said, must be capable of ground attack. All attack aircraft must be capable of defending themselves. It was a complete reversal of pre-war thinking, and it was born directly from the lessons of the Thunderbolt. The P-47's versatility became the blueprint. Its lineage is unmistakable in every American multi-role fighter that followed. The F-84 Thunderjet, jet-powered, but designed to drop bombs like its predecessor, the F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber that extended the Thunderbolts' philosophy into the Cold War. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed explicitly to carry forward the ground attack mission and named to honor the P-47 itself. Even aircraft like the F-4 Phantom, F-16 Fighting Falcon, F-15E, Strike Eagle, and F-A-18 Hornet owe part of their DNA to the P-47's revolutionary concept. Multi-role capability wasn't just a convenience, it was now a requirement, and every jet that took off with bombs under its wings and missiles on its pylons carried forward the idea first proven in the skies over Europe. The training, too, was transformed. Thunderbolt pilots had required over 200 flight hours before combat, including dive bombing, strafing, rocket attacks, and low-altitude navigation. This comprehensive preparation became the new standard. Fighter pilots were no longer taught to simply dogfight. They were trained to think as mission commanders, capable of adjusting to any role at a moment's notice. The P-47 proved that adaptability wasn't a feature, it was a necessity. And in a world that was rapidly transitioning into the jet age, that truth held even more weight. The shape of the aircraft might change, its speed and altitude might increase, but the need to adapt to the mission in real time, that was eternal. In Part 9, we'll follow the post-war journey of the Thunderbolt, how it continued to serve, influence foreign air forces, and leave behind a blueprint for future generations of aerial combatants. The war had ended, but the P-47 Thunderbolt's mission was far from over. As the Allies celebrated victory, thousands of Thunderbolts stood ready on airfields across Europe and the Pacific. Though newer, faster jets were beginning to emerge, the value of the P-47 had not diminished. It had proven itself not just in battle, but in concept, and that concept had a long future ahead. In the immediate post-war years, the Thunderbolt found new life with America's allies. Through military aid programs and surplus sales, hundreds of P-47s were shipped overseas. France, Italy, Brazil, and Mexico adopted the aircraft into their air forces. In these nations, the P-47 offered more than just hardware. It delivered a combat-tested doctrine, one where flexibility, survivability, and sheer striking power outweighed the flash of speed or agility alone. In Brazil, P-47s flown by the Brazilian Expeditionary Force had already earned respect during their late-war missions in Italy. Their pilots, trained under U.S. command, executed bombing and strafing runs that mirrored the tactics developed over Normandy and the Ardennes. After the war, Brazil retained the Thunderbolt in active service for years, refining the fighter-bomber doctrine for their own defense strategy. Even in peacetime, the Thunderbolt had a purpose. It became a cornerstone of training. New pilots learned the fundamentals of combat in the rugged, forgiving cockpit of a P-47. The aircraft's durability made it ideal for learning high-performance maneuvers, weapons delivery, and mission coordination. It taught young airmen how to fly, how to fight, and, most importantly, how to think like warriors in the sky. Though the jet age advanced quickly, the philosophy born in the Thunderbolt refused to fade. The Korean War would soon erupt, and while the P-47 itself did not return in force, its legacy flew on in the F-84 Thunderjet. A direct descendant, unlike its high-altitude predecessors, the F-84 embraced the low-level strike missions that had defined the P-47's success. It dropped bombs, fired rockets, and even carried early nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, back in the US, the Air National Guard continued flying P-47s well into the 1950s. For a generation of pilots, the Thunderbolt was their first taste of military aviation. Its roar, its heft, its unforgiving honesty in the sky, it demanded respect, and it gave lessons no classroom could provide. For many, it was the aircraft that turned them from students into soldiers. Air shows and museums soon ensured that the P-47 would never be forgotten. Restored Thunderbolts became flying memorials. Veterans watched them with tearful pride, remembering the days when the skies above Europe were thick with the sound of their engines. To younger generations, the aircraft offered a living history lesson, a machine that told the story of how America had learned to fight not just harder, but smarter. The P-47 had started as a misunderstood beast. Too heavy, too slow, too big. Yet it ended its service as a hero in nearly every role an aircraft could perform. That journey, from rejection to revolution, became its greatest legacy, not just as a machine, but as proof of what could be achieved when necessity, ingenuity, and courage intersected in the crucible of war. In Part 10, we'll take a closer look at the man behind the machine, Alexander Kartveli, and the visionary engineering that made the Thunderbolt more than just a plane. It made it a turning point in aviation history. Behind every great machine stands a mind that dared to imagine it. For the P-47 Thunderbolt, that mind belonged to Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born immigrant, engineer, and innovator whose vision shaped not just a single aircraft, but the future of aerial warfare. As the world marveled at what the Thunderbolt accomplished in combat, few realized how much of that legacy began long before a single bolt was turned. Kartveli arrived in America with a gift for design and a deep understanding of European aeronautics. At Republic Aviation, he wasn't interested in chasing trends. He was focused on solving problems. When the Army Air Forces called for a new high-altitude interceptor in 1940, Kartveli didn't just sketch a plane. He reimagined what a fighter could be. The result would be the XP-47B, an aircraft so ahead of its time that some questioned whether it could even get off the ground. The XP-47B was big. It used a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp engine, delivering 2,000 horsepower and eventually far more. Kartveli insisted on building the frame to withstand 12 Gs, twice what the Army required. He designed it with enough structural strength to carry over 5 times the bomb load originally asked for. Critics scoffed at the size. They called it a brute. But Kartveli wasn't building for elegance. He was building for war. His foresight became critical. When frontline pilots began experimenting with strafing runs and dive bombing, the P-47's rugged frame absorbed the stress. When engineers needed to install heavier bombs and rockets, the airframe didn't need redesign. It had been ready from the start. When additional roles, reconnaissance, communications, even leaflet drops were added, the Thunderbolt adapted without hesitation. Unlike many aircraft of the era, the P-47 was overbuilt by design. This allowed field modifications to expand its capabilities in real time. While other manufacturers halted production lines to redesign aircraft, Republic kept rolling out Thunderbolts without pause. In 4 straight years of war, not a single day of production was lost to a major design overhaul. That wasn't just engineering, it was industrial genius. Kartveli's engineering legacy didn't end with the P-47. He later designed the F-84 Thunderjet and contributed to the development of the F-105 Thunderchief, each one an evolution of the fighter-bomber concept he helped pioneer. His fingerprints are found not just in machines, but in the very doctrine of the U.S. Air Force. Design for adaptability, overbuild for the unexpected, and trust pilots to find new ways to use your creation. Though not a household name, Kartveli's work earned the admiration of pilots and commanders alike. They trusted the Thunderbolt because it was built by someone who respected the risks they faced. The cockpit was spacious, the engine reliable, the systems intuitive. More than once, pilots came home in aircraft riddled with holes, landing gear jammed, hydraulics gone, and still flying. That trust, born of design, became the bond between machine and man. In every battlefield where the Thunderbolt flew, it carried Kartveli's signature strength and vision. And though the war ended, his influence endured. His approach to aircraft design shaped generations of American aviation engineers. He didn't just build machines, he built platforms that could evolve with the battle. In Part 11, we'll return to the ground, to the airmen and crews who flew, maintained, and relied on the Thunderbolt every day. Their stories, their fears, their triumphs, their sacrifices brought the aircraft's legacy to life in ways blueprints never could. For all its steel and firepower, the P-47 Thunderbolt story is ultimately human. It was the hands that turned its wrenches, the eyes that scanned enemy skies, and the hearts that trusted it to bring them home. The pilots and ground crews who lived with the Thunderbolt knew it not as a marvel of engineering, but as a partner in survival, a machine that, when pushed to its limits, never gave up. Pilots often described their first encounter with the Thunderbolt with a mix of awe and doubt. It was massive, bulky by fighter standards. Getting airborne in one felt like wrestling a charging bull into the sky. But those who learned its rhythm came to love it. They knew it would dive faster than anything in the sky, shrug off punishment that would cripple other planes, and, more often than not, get them back alive, even with flak holes in the wings or smoke pouring from the engine. Lieutenant John Jack Foster, a member of the 56th Fighter Group, once recounted how his P-47 took over 100 hits during a strafing run over Germany. The canopy was cracked, the engine coughed, yet the aircraft flew true, and he landed safely on a makeshift strip in Belgium. "Any other bird," he said, "I'd have been a memory." For many pilots, that was the essence of the Thunderbolt. It gave them a fighting chance when everything else said they shouldn't make it. Ground crews formed the backbone of this relationship. Working in mud, snow, and summer heat, they kept the Thunderbolts flying, changing engines in the field, refitting bombs in hours, adapting to every field modification with little more than grit and a wrench. A crew chief might see his pilot off 3 times a day, knowing the risk each time. Their pride wasn't just in the aircraft, it was in sending their pilot into danger with the best chance of returning. They painted names and nose art on the fuselages: T-Bolt Terror, Misfire, Ruthless Ruth. These were more than decoration, they were declarations of spirit. Pilots often developed superstitions about their aircraft. Some refused to change planes, others kept a lucky charm in the cockpit. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a tool of war, it was a companion, temperamental, fierce, but faithful. The emotional weight carried by these men ran deep. The loss of a pilot didn't just mean one less aircraft in the sky, it meant an empty bunk, a silent mess tent seat, a gap in the formation. Ground crews would walk past the wreckage of a downed Thunderbolt and know instantly if it had been one of theirs. In that bond between man and machine was a grief and pride too heavy for words. Yet for all the danger, there was camaraderie too. Pilots returning from missions swapped stories about near misses, lucky dives, kills confirmed. They laughed about the quirks of their aircraft, debated tactics late into the night, and celebrated every safe landing as a small miracle. The Thunderbolt, with its guttural roar and brute presence, gave them a feeling of control in a world spinning out of it. In Part 12, we'll journey through the pivotal battles where the Thunderbolt left its deepest mark, from the beaches of Normandy to the final airfields of Germany, and how those moments carved its place into the soul of a generation. June 6, 1944. D-Day. As the first wave of American troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the skies above echoed with the thunder of wings. Among them were the unmistakable silhouettes of P-47 Thunderbolts, diving, strafing, bombing with relentless precision. This was not their first mission, nor would it be their last, but it was the day the Thunderbolt became indispensable. The statistics from that day were staggering: 1,985 P-47 sorties, over 500 tons of bombs dropped, more than 135,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition unleashed. They tore through rail yards, gun emplacements, fuel depots, and convoys, clearing the path for the largest amphibious assault in history. German forces never stood a chance. Every move they made was shadowed from above. Every counterattack was answered by fire from the sky. But D-Day was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Thunderbolts became the hammer of Allied ground operations. When infantry units called for help, P-47s responded within minutes. In the hedgerows of France, where tanks bogged down and visibility was poor, it was the Thunderbolt that broke the stalemate, dive-bombing enemy positions, torching armored columns, and cutting off reinforcements. It changed the very rhythm of the battlefield. In the battle for the Falaise Pocket, Thunderbolts delivered devastation on an unprecedented scale. Operating in tight shifts, they struck from dawn to dusk. Over 1,000 vehicles were confirmed destroyed by air power. One pilot described the valley as a graveyard of metal and smoke. German soldiers, once trained to fear tanks, now feared the unmistakable growl of an approaching P-47 more. During the Battle of the Bulge, as fog and snow grounded most aircraft, specially equipped Thunderbolts kept flying. On December 23rd alone, they flew nearly 650 sorties, destroying over 400 enemy vehicles. When the skies cleared, they unleashed a week of fury that turned the tide. Tanks, convoys, even horse-drawn wagons were caught in the open and annihilated. Allied commanders credited the P-47s with halting the German advance and saving thousands of American lives. By early 1945, Thunderbolts were not just supporting the front, they were defining it. In Operation Clarion, their mission was simple: destroy every locomotive, bridge and rail yard left standing. And they did. In a single day, they took out 89 locomotives and over 1,000 rail cars. It wasn't glamorous, but it was decisive. The German army couldn't move, couldn't supply, couldn't fight. The Me-262 jet may have represented Germany's technological gamble, but even those aircraft were helpless on the ground. Thunderbolts, patrolling jet airfields, caught them on takeoff and destroyed them by the dozens. A weapon that had started as an escort fighter was now executing precision attacks that shaped the war's endgame. Everywhere the Allies advanced, the P-47 was overhead. It wasn't always the fastest. It didn't turn like a Spitfire, but it could fly through a storm, take enemy fire, drop a bomb with terrifying accuracy, and still have enough left to get home. In Part 13, we'll dissect the numbers behind the legend, the missions, the kills, the payloads, and why no single statistic can truly capture the revolutionary impact the Thunderbolt had on warfare, strategy, and history itself. By the spring of 1945, the numbers told a story of staggering scale and silent revolution. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had flown more than 746,000 sorties. It had dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, fired 135,000 rockets, expended 119 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. But beneath those cold statistics was something much warmer, much more human, a fundamental shift in how war was fought and won. The P-47 was responsible for destroying over 3,900 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, and more than 3,200 on the ground. That alone would have earned it a place in the pantheon of great fighters. But its legacy was cemented by what it did to the enemy's war machine. 9,000 locomotives shattered, 86,000 railway cars wrecked, 68,000 motor vehicles reduced to ash, 6,000 armored units, including tanks and assault guns, turned into burning hulks. And it did so with extraordinary efficiency. The Thunderbolt's combat loss rate was only 0.7% per mission. That meant for every 1,000 missions flown, just 7 aircraft were lost. The B-17, by contrast, often suffered 5% losses per mission early in the war. And the economic cost? A P-47 delivered destruction at less than 15%, the cost of a heavy bomber per ton of ordnance. Less manpower, less support, more flexibility. It was the arithmetic of victory. Even more impressive was the operational tempo. A P-47 squadron could launch 3 missions a day from forward airfields. Multiply that by dozens of squadrons across Europe, and the result was a relentless hammering of German forces day after day, with no place left to hide. The P-47 transformed tactical impact into strategic effect. It blurred the lines between air superiority, ground support, and interdiction. It was air power with reach, with precision, and with purpose. The adaptability of the design was unmatched. 28 major variants were produced. Over 430 field modification kits allowed constant upgrades without halting production. Reinforced wings for heavier bomb loads. British-style rocket rails, improved oil cooling, computing gun sights. The Thunderbolt evolved faster than the enemy could adapt. Even as the war changed, the aircraft stayed one step ahead. At its peak, Republic Aviation was producing 35 Thunderbolts per day. Over 15,600 were built in total, more than any other American fighter during the war. 2 massive plants in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, ran non-stop for 4 years. They didn't just build planes, they built dominance. But the most telling number was this. By March 1945, German rail traffic in forward areas had declined by 75%. Not due to strategic bombing from high altitude, but due to fighter-bomber attacks by aircraft like the P-47. The infrastructure was gone. The fuel convoys were gone. The movement was gone. And with that, the German war machine collapsed. These weren't just statistics. They were the measure of a revolution, of an aircraft that proved flexibility, durability, and firepower could be combined into a single devastating platform. The Thunderbolt didn't fit neatly into the categories of pre-war doctrine. It shattered them. In Part 14, we'll witness the final missions of the Thunderbolt as World War II drew to a close, and how even in its last days over Europe, the aircraft continued to innovate, dominate, and redefine what a combat aircraft could be. March to May 1945 marked the final crescendo of the P-47 Thunderbolt's wartime symphony. Though victory was within reach, the work was not yet done. As Allied ground forces surged across the Rhine and deep into Germany, Thunderbolts were still in the air, flying missions every hour, every day, until the very last German gun went silent. This final chapter of the war was defined not by giant battles, but by constant attrition, of infrastructure, of mobility, of morale. And the Thunderbolt, now operating at its evolutionary peak, was uniquely suited to this kind of warfare. The P-47M variant could reach speeds of 470 mph, nearly touching the performance of the earliest jets. The P-47N, designed for Pacific operations, showed an incredible range of 2,350 miles with full bomb loadouts. These weren't just upgrades, they were final refinements of an aircraft that had learned and evolved through every stage of war. In these closing weeks, Thunderbolts flew missions unlike any seen before. They directed artillery strikes, delivered emergency supplies to surrounded units, dropped propaganda leaflets, and served as communication relays for advancing infantry. A single squadron could switch roles multiple times in one day, adapting to weather, terrain, and enemy disposition. The fighter bomber had become something even greater, a multi-role platform that blurred the lines between air and ground, strategy and tactics, destruction and information. On March 23, 1945, one of the most decisive blows came when P-47s ambushed a squadron of Mu-62s during takeoff at Liepheim airfield. The German jets, powerful in the air but vulnerable on the runway, were caught in a moment of helpless acceleration. In just 5 minutes, 8 jet fighters were destroyed, more than the Luftwaffe could replace in a week. The P-47, once mocked as slow and heavy, had ended the dreams of Germany's jet-powered salvation. As Operation Clarion reached its climax, Thunderbolts laid waste to what remained of Germany's transportation grid. Locomotives were hit with uncanny accuracy. Rail yards were turned into mazes of twisted metal. Roads, once bustling with troop movements and supplies, were abandoned. Even waterways were targeted. Nothing moved without risk. The once mighty German military was left stranded, fighting isolated battles with dwindling resources. Then came the quiet. In early May, German forces surrendered. Thunderbolt squadrons received the news not with celebration, but with reflection. The men who flew and maintained the P-47 had given everything they had, for years in all weather, over fields of fire. Some had returned again and again, their aircraft patched with bullet holes, oil stains, and soot. Others hadn't come home at all. The last missions flown by P-47s in Europe were not attacks, but observations. Reconnaissance patrols, flights over shattered towns, escorts for surrendering enemy planes. Even in peace, the Thunderbolt remained on duty, bearing silent witness to the cost of victory. In Part 15, we close with the deeper meaning of this story, the human cost of war, the power of adaptation, and how the Thunderbolt taught the world that victory doesn't come from perfection, but from resilience. Stay with us to honor the legacy and reflect on what this aircraft truly represents. May 1945. Silence fell over Europe, not the silence of peace, but the stillness that follows exhaustion. Cities smoldered, bridges lay broken, rail lines ended in craters. And through that silence echoed a truth forged in smoke, steel, and sacrifice. Victory had not come from overwhelming force alone, but from adaptation, relentless, gritty, human adaptation. And at the center of that truth flew the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was never designed to carry history on its back. It began as an interceptor, too heavy, too awkward, too late, some said. But it evolved, piece by piece, mission by mission. What emerged wasn't the best fighter or the fastest bomber. It was something far more dangerous, a machine that could do everything, go anywhere and endure anything. The Germans never saw it coming, not because it was invisible, but because it broke every rule they had believed about air warfare. Behind every mission flown were the men who made the impossible seem routine. Pilots who pushed past exhaustion to fly 3 sorties a day. Ground crews who kept engines running in the mud. Engineers who trusted their overbuilt frames would hold. And commanders who understood that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in what a machine is built to do, but what it becomes under fire. The Thunderbolt didn't win the war alone, but it embodied the spirit of those who did. It was a weapon, yes, but also a message. That in war, as in life, flexibility beats rigidity. That strength lies in resilience. That no matter the odds, if you can adapt faster than your enemy, you can endure, overcome, and triumph. Long after the war, Thunderbolts flew in the air forces of allies. They trained new generations of pilots. They were displayed in museums and flown in air shows, not as relics, but as reminders of what was possible, of what was endured, and of what was won, not just in battles, but in hearts. Today, when we speak of modern multi-role fighters, precision bombing, and mission flexibility, we are speaking the language first written by the P-47. The aircraft that carried half a bomber's payload flew with the tenacity of a soldier and refused to be boxed in by expectation. The Luftwaffe never expected the Thunderbolt to become what it did. But the war didn't reward those who expected. It rewarded those who adapted. The Thunderbolt was America's answer to a brutal question, and it answered with courage, innovation, and relentless firepower. So as we close the story of the P-47, let us remember the human cost behind every sortie, the thousands who flew, fought, and fell. The sacrifices made not for glory, but for freedom. The aircraft was only the tool. The legacy belongs to the people who used it. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you, your reflections, your family's stories, your connection to this incredible chapter of history. Let's keep the memory alive, together.